Well, welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today I have on Dr. Margolis to discuss a recent study he authored on low carbohydrate availability, impairing hypertrophy and anaerobic performance. So that's going to be what we discuss today. So first off, thanks for joining me here today, Dr. Margolis.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the invite.
I think a good kind of first place for us to start here is just kind of what led you to doing this study in the first place? Why was this kind of a particular area that you kind of wanted to do a study on?
Sure. So the initial intent of the study was actually to look at metabolic flexibility in response to either a low carbohydrate, high fat, or high carbohydrate, moderate fat 24-hour refeeding. So in that study, what we did is we normalize our participants' glycogen stores by having them come in. They do a bout of cycling till depletion. Then we refed them 6 grams per kg carbohydrate for 48 hours. After that 48-hour period, they came back to our lab. We did our cycling glycogen depletion exercise again. And then this time they either got a high fat, so it was 3 grams per kilogram of fat in that diet and 1.5 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate, or a high carb, which was the same as our normalization of the 6 grams per kilogram of their body mass. We did a series of muscle biopsies before they exercised, after they exercised, and then when they came back 24 hours after the diet, we did another muscle biopsy, had them complete a bout of cycling at 60% of their maximal effort, and did another biopsy at the end of that. What we were looking for was we wanted to understand if you're going into a bout of exercise with low muscle glycogen, aerobic exercise in this scenario, what impact was that going to have on the rate of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation? So the participants came in, we gave them a carbohydrate beverage. They either had their low or their adequate glycogen stores at this point, and they drank the carb beverage during the 80 minutes of steady state exercise. We took some breath measurements and blood measurements during that so we could actually measure how they were oxidizing the carbohydrate. What we found was that there was no difference in how the participants used the carbohydrate from the drink that we provided. The main difference that we saw was that they were actually just oxidizing less total carbohydrate when they had low glycogen stores. So they were preserving all of those endogenous stores, and they were primarily mobilizing their fat stores for oxidative purposes. These changes in metabolism were corroborated in our muscle biopsies, where we saw increases in gene expression of fatty acid translocase, fatty acid binding protein, carnitine palmitoyltransferase. All of these things that regulate fatty acid uptake, mobilization, oxidation, were all higher when they went into the exercise bout consuming the low carbohydrate, high fat diet. So for a fatty acid mobilization purpose, like this is exactly what you would want to see when you're on a low carb diet. The intent is to try to increase your body's ability to oxidize fat primarily for fuel while you're sparing your endogenous fuel source. So that was the primary thing that we wanted to look at. And we also wanted to understand, if we do refeed you with carbohydrate, is there any negative effect in how you're using that carb for fuel during exercise? And the answer was no. So the next thing that we wanted to understand is, well, what about the rest of the picture? What's actually going on with muscle anabolism, all of those regulatory markers? So the next thing that we did was we looked at the pathways that regulate myogenesis, so PAX7, MyoD, myogenin. Interestingly, we saw that when the participants came into the exercise bout with the low glycogen stores, the expression of all 3 of those genes was lower compared to when they came in with the adequate glycogen stores. Looking at mTOR signaling, which is the master regulator of muscle hypertrophy, we actually didn't see any differences in those signaling pathways. So that was interesting that we saw that these markers of muscle regeneration, myogenesis, were lower, but hypertrophy really wasn't changed in this regard. To try to get a better understanding of why the myogenesis might be lower, we did some metabolomics work. So in the blood, we looked at hundreds of different metabolites that are related to carbohydrate, fat, and protein oxidation. What we saw was that the downstream metabolites of branched chain amino acids, so your leucine, isoleucine, and valine, were all higher when the participants came in with the low glycogen stores. So that suggests that because they had low carbohydrate availability, they needed to use fuel not only from fat, but they were also breaking down some more of their endogenous amino acid stores, which likely contributed to that reduction in our markers of myogenesis, that PAX7, MyoD, and myogenin. So, which ultimately could potentially compromise an individual's ability to adequately recover from a bout of exercise like that if they're coming in with low glycogen stores.
Gotcha. So, and just maybe define a couple terms here for kind of more Gen Pop people listening to this. So, when you say like carb oxidation or fat oxidation, what do you kind of mean by that? What does that kind of mean?
Yep. So what we're looking for here is that we're trying to understand how your body is using these macronutrients as fuel. So how much carbohydrates in a gram per minute basis is your muscle burning for fuel use during a bout of exercise? So to do this, we use indirect calorimetry, where we just have the participants breathing into a metabolic cart so we can capture all of the oxygen that they're consuming and the CO2 that they're producing. When you're trying to measure fat and carbohydrate oxidation, you're looking at the ratio between those two. So the oxygen, again, consumed and the carbon dioxide produced. The closer that ratio is to being 1, that means the more carbohydrate that you're burning for fuel. The closer it is to 0.7 would be as low as you would go, the more fat that you are oxidizing. So when the participants came in with their low glycogen stores, that what's known as a respiratory exchange ratio with the O2 to the CO2 was lower, indicating that the participants were oxidizing and they were using more fat for fuel compared to when they had the adequate glycogen stores, which again, that's the desired effect for these low carbohydrate diets, is that from a physique perspective, you're trying to maximize the amount of fat that you are burning for fuel in an attempt to, somewhat reduce the amount of body fat that you may have to potentially, lean up.
Gotcha. Okay, I think that definitely clarifies things.
Sorry about that.
No, you're totally fine. It kind of reminds me a little bit of like so my background is like exercise science, and I have a master's degree in that. So definitely took me back to like my master's programs talking about carb oxidation and stuff like that. But I'm sure there's people listening that are like, what in the world does that even mean? So yeah, that's super helpful. And to me, one key thing that stuck out there was that, so, and correct me if I'm interpreting any of this incorrectly, but you kind of mentioned that when in more of a kind of glycogen depleted state, they were still kind of oxidizing some of their kind of stored protein. And that was kind of one of the reasons why that maybe a lower carbohydrate diet may be less beneficial for kind of hypertrophic responses. Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
Yes, that's exactly what we're hypothesizing in the results that we've seen here. That and just to put a caveat on this, the study that we did was 24 hours, so it was a fairly acute study. And maybe after this, we can talk a little bit about some of the longer term studies that have been done in this and what changes in body composition have been seen there. But certainly, just looking at this 24-hour period, the participants, when they were on the low carb diet and they had the low glycogen going in, just looking at the metabolite data, they were burning more of their endogenous protein stores for fuel. So they were breaking down essentially muscle to release amino acids that could then be used for energy yielding purposes to help fuel their performance during their exercise bout. That's obviously not ideal. What you want your protein stores to be doing is to be refeeding into your amino acid pool, so you have appropriate amino acids available to support muscle protein synthesis that would then facilitate, greater muscle hypertrophy in response to exercise. So if you're using your amino acids for fuel source rather than for hypertrophic gains, you might be minimizing the amount of either muscle that you can gain from an exercise bout, or that the amount of amino acids available to help facilitate the recovery of your muscles to then be prepared for a subsequent bout of exercise.
Gotcha. And did you also mention there that you also saw it in kind of some different signaling pathways when it comes to like mTOR and different things like that, that maybe there's some of that signaling data that might suggest that, hey, in that lower carbohydrate state, this also might not be as good for kind of someone focused on physique development, growing muscle and stuff like that?
Yeah, so we saw a normal mTOR signaling response in our participants. So just activating that pathway in and of itself seemed to be maintained. The reason that likely occurred in our study was because the amount of glycogen that they reduced during our intervention was about half of what you would normally have stored in your muscle. There's some other studies that have reduced muscle glycogen to about 75% of what you would normally have. And in those studies, they have seen reductions in mTOR signaling. So it is possible that just because we didn't deplete the glycogen so much, that the mTOR signaling was actually able to be maintained. What we did see reductions in, though, were markers of muscle myogenesis or regeneration. So those are the kind of looking more at your satellite cell markers. So the expression of the gene PAX7, of MyoD, and myogenin were all lower when the participants were on the low carbohydrate diet versus the adequate carbohydrate diet. So reductions in those markers would suggest that your ability to, activate muscle regeneration and thus muscle recovery might be impaired when following one of these low carbohydrate refeeding regimens.
And when you mentioned earlier in kind of those longer term studies, and I know kind of in this paper, it mentions maybe carbohydrate restriction for up to 8 to 12 weeks and kind of seeing some different things there. So what did you guys kind of see in maybe some of these longer term studies?
Yeah, so these longer term studies, they haven't been conducted by our institute. So these were parts of systematic reviews that we've conducted looking at other institutes' research and what they found. The main finding out of these systematic reviews is that when you're on these low carbohydrate diets, there's reductions in body mass. There's mainly reductions coming from fat mass. So again, the desired effect of these low carbohydrate diets is generally that you want to reduce fat mass by increasing fat oxidation. So these diets are certainly effective in doing that. One thing that seemed to be kind of not advantageous is that the participants in these longer studies, they were able to maintain their muscle mass, but when you compared them to the groups that were doing the same type of study but had the high carbohydrate diet, they were actually able to see some gains in muscle. So these individuals, they weren't able to increase the muscle mass at the same extent that the individuals who were eating the higher carbohydrate diets were. And there's a couple of reasons for why that might be. One is that the acute findings that we found in our study, where we see this increase in amino acid mobilization for fuel and reductions in myogenesis, might carry out in these more chronic states where you're eating these diets for a longer period of time and you have these impairments in muscle hypertrophy because of changes in how your body's using amino acids for fuel and all of the cellular adaptations that go along with that. The other explanation, and this might be the more likely one, is that when you're following one of these low carbohydrate diets, it becomes very difficult to consume an adequate amount of energy to actually maintain energy balance. So, like I said earlier, most of the participants on these low carbohydrate diets were actually losing body mass. The studies that were being conducted, that was not their intent. They were actually trying to get the participants to eat enough food to maintain their body mass throughout and then look for those changes in body composition and physical performance. What happens on these diets pretty commonly is that it becomes very difficult to meet your energy needs just by the nature of how restrictive these diets are. So if you think about it, we eat 3 macronutrients a day: protein, fat, and carbohydrate. Carbohydrate, for the majority of the US population, is the primary energy source for our diets. When you cut that out, you cut out a large portion of energy that people are typically going to be consuming on a daily basis. So to try to make up for all of that energy for using protein and fat, it becomes difficult. So even though these studies weren't really designed to look for weight loss and negative energy balance, it was just kind of the nature of what happened with these participants. When you don't have an adequate amount of energy to support your muscle, especially if you are going into it as a lean individual, you're generally going to have reductions not only in fat mass, but also in fat-free mass, so your muscle mass. You can combat this by having an appropriate workout regimen where you are adding resistance exercise that's going to cause that, mechanistic strain that turns on all of those anabolic signaling pathways to at least help maintain your muscle mass. But if you're not eating enough calories, it becomes very difficult to gain muscle, especially, again, if you are a lean individual. This is a very different scenario for individuals who are overweight or persons with obesity that are trying to reduce their weight because they have all of those extra endogenous stores that might be protective for muscle. But if you're a leaner individual and you don't have as much body fat mass to lose, it becomes more difficult to maintain your muscle mass when you're in a negative energy state.
Absolutely. And I think that the overall point on energy balance is a really important consideration, as, just when losing weight in general, you might see some losses in lean body mass. And
Yep.
when they were looking at someone's muscle mass, was it mostly lean body mass that they were kind of looking at in terms of, so also including like potential water components and stuff like that within that?
Yeah, most of these studies were using DEXA body scans, so dual X-ray absorptiometry, which is fat-free mass. So that's any tissue that is not your fat mass is going to be carried into that as well. So yeah, they're not just isolating the muscle mass in and of itself.
So one thought that comes to mind is like in a higher carbohydrate diet, when you kind of have fully stocked glycogen, I believe like each gram of glycogen also binds to a little bit of water. So maybe those individuals hold on to a little bit more water just inherently with kind of that extra carbohydrate. So maybe their lean body mass wouldn't show as much of kind of a drop, but the group that might show a drop, maybe some of that is related to kind of water retention. What would you kind of say to that?
Certainly, yeah, if you have higher glycogen stores, you are going to be retaining more water than somebody who restricts carbohydrate because glycogen is a small molecule. Water is going to follow it into the muscle. So when that goes down, yeah, the amount of water in your body is going to be reduced a little bit. For shorter term studies, I would say absolutely. You're looking at total body water. That's going to have to be a consideration when you're looking at changes in body mass and then also in your body composition. Generally, for longer term studies, it becomes less of an issue because there has been time for these adaptations. So, like anybody who's been on a low carbohydrate diet, I come from the era of Atkins was the big one back then that people would go on those diets and they would be like, oh, I lost 10 pounds in the first week. It's like, well, yeah, a lot of it, was water because you're restricting your carbohydrate. And then if they reintroduce carbohydrate, that weight goes back up. But if they maintain the Atkins diet and they or any diet, I probably shouldn't be throwing out brand names here. Any low carbohydrate diet, if you're maintaining that, the rate of weight loss is going to start to decline rapidly because you're not losing body water anymore. That if you're maintaining that negative energy balance, you're actually losing real mass at that point.
Gotcha. Cool. I think that provides a lot of good context there. And you guys also, it looks like you also looked at how this kind of carbohydrate availability affects anaerobic performance, affects someone's strength. So what did you guys kind of find when it comes to maybe some of these lower carbohydrate diets compared to higher ones when it comes to someone's kind of strength performance and stuff like that?
Yeah. So when you're looking at anaerobic performance, or, your body's ability to generate power to move quickly from point A to point B, there are going to be reductions in that. And most of the studies that we included in this systematic review were looking at, time to exhaustion or things like that. So how long could you cycle or sprint at 80 to 90% of your maximal effort, and your ability to do that when you don't have a lot of glycogen on board in your muscles is going to decline. And it's going to decline because carbohydrates are a readily available fuel source that is going to support and prolong this type of anaerobic exercise in these really high intensity workloads where your body isn't able to get sufficient amount of oxygen to your muscle to then turn on fat oxidation. So if you're restricting carbohydrate and sprint performance is something that is important to you, having restricted carbohydrate might result in a negative effect on that type of performance. Looking at muscle strength, so it could be squatting, deadlifting, things like that. It's unlikely that low carbohydrate or carbohydrate restricted diets are going to have any negative effect on those type of muscle outcomes. So if you are training appropriately, if you have progressive increases in what you're doing or periodizing your workouts, your ability to maintain or gain muscle strength should not necessarily be impaired following these type of carbohydrate restricted diets. So that probably is going to come back to the context in which people are using these diets and what they're using them for. So for individuals, if it's more of an aesthetic type of athlete, bodybuilders, things like that, who want to, lean out, get rid of as much water as possible, these type of diets are probably not going to have any real negative effect on them if they're not following them for a prolonged period of time. And if they're exercising appropriately, it shouldn't have any negative effect on any of their strength. For athletes who are less concerned about, aesthetics and their ability to sprint, move from point A to point B is the main thing that they are concerned with, these type of diets probably are not going to be the most appropriate thing for them to enhance or support their physical performance.
And just a quick anecdotal experience of that. When I was during my master's degree, for some reason, we had to do Woodgate tests all the time. And the first time I had to do one, I was like leaning out and kind of in a fat loss phase and stuff. So I was restricting my carbohydrate, and like, it was the worst thing I've ever experienced. And then I think towards the end of the semester, I did it again, but I was no longer in like a carbohydrate reduced state. And it was, my performance was significantly better. It was 10 times easier. And I didn't really train any differently between the kind of two periods. And another thing I noticed was that for my training itself, my strength in the gym really didn't change a whole lot, especially like my relative strength to my body weight. But I did notice a pretty big difference when it came to this kind of, and for those listening, Wingate test, it's more of what we would classically kind of think as an anaerobic test. Yeah. So with that, this kind of is, it is definitely anecdotal, and it's not like saying that this is true for everybody, but it definitely coincides with kind of what you just mentioned with, for someone focused on more anaerobic stuff, kind of having a lower carbohydrate diet might impact them more compared to someone that might be, more of a power lifter or kind of focusing on more kind of strength oriented workouts. Does that sound pretty fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate and supported by the literature that, yeah, if you are trying to do a wind gate where it is this all out cycling for 30 seconds, your ability to generate power is going to be lower if you are in a glycogen depleted versus a glycogen repleted state. Um, and yeah, the effects that it's going to have on your total ability to move weight for squats, deadlifts, things like that, it's probably not going to have as big of an effect. If you're trying to do some circuit training or high intensity interval training, uh, you might have some negative effects. Those type of workouts are probably going to feel and be harder if you don't have adequate amount of carbohydrate on board.
Perfect. Well, we are coming up on time here, but if we could just end with maybe a few kind of core takeaways from kind of the work you've done and this research related to kind of lower and higher carbohydrate diets, and maybe takeaways, even especially towards someone listening to this, is probably more kind of oriented into physique development, bodybuilding, some strength training as well.
Yeah.
What would maybe be some kind of core takeaways for them?
Yeah, I would say that the context of our research is definitely key, not just ours, any research. That for the type of work that I do, I work for the United States Army, and we're really looking at these type of diets more from a performance aspect rather than a physique aspect. And for our population, the ability to move quickly from point A to point B is incredibly important. So in that regard, these type of diets and having low glycogen, low carbohydrate available to support and sustain that performance, you could have really negative effects in the context of a military population. When we're looking at it in the general population of individuals who are focused more on physique and just doing their normal daily exercises, you can be on these diets and you can still get the type of adaptations in body composition that are desired. So again, these type of diets do help with increasing fat oxidation. The nature of the restrictive nature of these diets are also going to likely contribute to negative energy balances that if the intent is to cut weight, they can be helpful in that. Just human nature, it's kind of easier just to look at this one whole food group and say, if I don't eat any of that, I'm going to be able to meet my goal, versus looking at things more in a moderation aspect that can be a little bit trickier for individuals. So following these type of diets for a certain type of person can be easier, and it can be effective in the type of changes in body composition that you're looking for without having any negative impact on strength gains. So again, it just comes back to the context in which individuals are following these diets. If it's for a performance aspect, my recommendation is to avoid these diets. There really is no research that's showing that if you're following an adequate carbohydrate diet, that's going to have any negative impact on your performance. There is certainly enough research to show that if you are following a carbohydrate restricted diet, there is possibly going to be negative effects on physical performance. So from a performance aspect, the safer bet is to go with the tried and true carbohydrate diet. If it is more for these physique type outcomes and performance is not as big of a concern, then there's no real harm in following them.
Gotcha. And that kind of coincides with my biases as well, to where it's like, for general population clients that I coach, when trying to help them with fat loss, it's like, hey, we just need to sustain a calorie deficit on some sort of diet to where we can restrict calories and adhere to it over the long run. And whether that is lower carb or kind of higher fat or whatever it might be, it, at the end of the day, as long as we can maintain a calorie deficit, eat enough protein, have a good training program, it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. So I think that those are definitely some good takeaways there. If people want to kind of stay up to date with the work you're doing, if any more research comes out, is there anywhere that they can go to kind of follow that and stay up to date with that?
Yeah, so I work at the United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine. You can follow our Institute at Team Usarium on Twitter. I don't have any socials myself, but all of the work that I publish is on PubMed.org. And I do kind of rely on people like you to help, spread the good word of some of the work that we're doing to the general population.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great. Thank you.